Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing another Sharks season in review, this time of the 14-15 Sharks season. Now, of course, the board does seem to be quite empty, and that is because of the fact that the Sharks, for the first time in a very long time, actually missed the playoffs in the 14-15 season. This was, of course, the aftermath of the 2014 collapse against the Los Angeles Kings in the first round. Fans had been wondering, or not necessarily just fans, but the whole NHL, all NHL fans had really been wondering where the Sharks were going to land in the 2010-2011 season. The Sharks were very competitive, but those were becoming a thing of the past. The 2012 season was a first-round exit. The 2013 season was quite competitive, a 7-game series against the Kings, but with the 2014 season, while looking at that series right now, it was still technically a hard-fought 7-game series loss to the eventual Stanley Cup champions, but of course, at the time, with all that emotion, it was a collapse, reverse sweep. It felt like it lacked emotion. That felt like the Sharks really lacked fight after they lost that Game 4. And so, during that offseason, Doug Wilson said that the Sharks were going to have to take a step back to try and take 2 steps forward. And there were a few pretty decently sized changes that went on during that offseason. The first and the biggest would be the Sharks decided to not re-sign Dan Boyle. Of course, he was getting up there in age, around 37 years old. So certainly quite close to retirement, so the Sharks did not extend him a contract. And then you had other players like Thornton and Marleau who were also getting up there in age, the wrong side of 30, getting to their mid-30s, even close to that. And so it was a situation where the Sharks decided to just move on from a player like Dan Boyle, who had been the top defenseman for the Sharks for many years. Other pretty small trades, certainly getting rid of bottom 6 players like James Shepherd, bottom 6 players like Andrew Desjardins, just trying to pick up some picks here or there and allowing maybe some younger players to try and get into the lineup and get a chance to play. Another massive change that would actually occur in the offseason would be removing Joe Thornton as the captain of the team. This was a pretty big, implied comment on Joe Thornton's leadership skills, even if maybe Doug Wilson wasn't necessarily intending something like that. But after your team sees a massive collapse that was seen as like this really big thing, removing your captain, especially when it's Joe Thornton, who's been with the team for so long, about a decade almost at that point, or a bit less than a decade, I guess. You're approaching a decade. It is a pretty big comment, so while there was no captain during that season, it still said a lot. And so during the regular season, there were some rifts that seemingly opened up between Doug Wilson and Joe Thornton. There were some comments made in public that made it seem as though there was some sort of feud going on between the Sharks' best player, I guess you could say at that time, as well as the Sharks' general manager, and even with a player like Patrick Marleau, who of course was the other face of the Sharks at this time. Marleau and Thornton had been rumored to have requested a trade. He had submitted a short list of teams to Doug Wilson of who he wanted to be traded to, and while that of course never materialized and Marleau would remain with the Sharks for the rest of that contract that he was on, it was still certainly something to write about. Now, the Sharks were, of course, still stuck with Antti Niemi for this season. This was the final year of his contract. And so during the year, the Sharks were just noticeably worse than they were the previous season. Now, that does not necessarily mean that most people expected the Sharks to miss the playoffs. Of course, in the previous year, the Sharks had put up over 100 points, over 50 wins in the regular season. And so while this was, of course, going to be a step-back style of season, it was predicted that the Sharks could make some sort of run at the wild card spot. And the Sharks did come somewhat close to that. Still 89 points on the season with 40 wins, 33 losses, and 9 overtime losses is somewhat respectable. But they would end up missing the playoffs, and it would indeed end up being that step back. But of course, now we know what would happen in the 15-16 season. The Sharks would take a bit more than just 2 steps forward. In terms of offense, it was Pavelski leading the way once again. 82 games played, 37 goals, so just falling short of the 40-goal mark as he had it the previous season. 33 assists for 70 points. Then Logan Couture also with the 82 games played, 27 goals, 40 assists for 67 points. Joe Thornton, 78 games played with only 16 goals and 49 assists for 65 points. Brent Burns, who after having played forward for a small chunk of the 12-13 season and for a big chunk, if not the entirety of the 13-14 season, ended up being back on defense and actually put up a very respectable and somewhat quiet 17 goals, 43 assists for 60 points. And so many people were surprised with Brent Burns' big performance in the 15-16 season, where he put up over 70 points and really led the team there as the top defenseman for the Sharks. The 60 points here was still very impressive and was maybe a precursor to that. Then it was Patrick Marleau, 82 games played, of course, but with only 19 goals, 38 assists, and 57 points. So a pretty disappointing season from Marleau. When it comes to those two faces of the Sharks organization, Marleau and Thornton, Thornton managed to stay on top of his game for a bit longer than Marleau did, as he had sort of begun his decline at this point, to the point where in the 15-16 season, Peter DeBoer had begun to use Marleau in a bit of a reduced role, while Thornton still managed to maintain really a top spot in the lineup. Then when it comes to Tommy Wingels at the 6th spot for the second straight year, very, very impressive for him, of course. 75 games played, 15 goals, 21 assists for 36 points. Then, as I said, of course, Niemi was still the starter for the San Jose Sharks. 61 games started, 31 wins, a 2.59 GAA, and a .914 save percentage. From the point of view of today, those goaltending stats do seem to be pretty decent, but it's very important to remember that the 14-15 season was one of the lowest scoring seasons of memory. The Art Ross winner was Jamie Benn with, I believe, 85, 86, or 87 points, something like that, which was the lowest from any Art Ross winner in the salary cap era, one of the lowest of all time, I would go so far as to say, at least since the existence of the award. And so, as I said, from the point of view of today, where goal scoring is way, way up and players are getting 100 points even just in the first 60 or 70 games of the season, back then, these stats were not great. The GAA certainly below average. The save percentage maybe a bit more average in line, but it wasn't that great of a season for Antti Niemi. And so it was no surprise that the Sharks would not necessarily re-sign him, especially after the disastrous playoffs he would have in the 2014 series against the Kings. In that collapse, he played a big part of that. But that will do it for this review. At the end of this season, Doug Wilson would make a much larger scale changes. The 2014 was sort of like a reactionary, as Doug Wilson had put it. It was a step back. The Sharks were mostly unloading a couple of assets, but not necessarily bringing anything in. But the 2015 offseason, which I'll get into in the next video, was really this. It sort of gave the Sharks a 2.0 style of look to them. Class dismissed.